Every town has its stories, the kind that nobody writes down, but everyone quietly knows. In this little town, people whispered about the old man at the bus stop. He was always there, day after day, as if rooted to that worn-down wooden bench beneath the flickering streetlight. Morning, noon, or evening, you could walk by and see him, sitting quietly, holding the same small photograph between his hands, like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Nobody really knew his name. To some, he was the ghost on Main Street. To others, that weird old guy at the stop. Kids joked about him. Teenagers sometimes threw glances his way and laughed under their breath. Adults passed him by without a word, too busy with their lives, too absorbed in their phones, their groceries, their commutes. The truth was, no one had ever seen him board a bus. That's what made him strange. Why sit at a bus stop every single day if you never actually ride? At first, people assumed he was homeless, but his clothes, while old, were always clean. His shoes were polished, though worn thin. He never begged for money. He never spoke first. He just sat there, quietly, as if waiting. Some thought maybe he was senile, confused about where he was. Others believed he was just lonely and wanted company. But nobody bothered to ask. The man's hands trembled slightly as he held the photograph. It was small, black and white, the edges frayed with time. If you pass close enough, you might catch a glimpse. A young woman, smiling brightly, holding a baby in her arms. The kind of picture that could have been taken decades ago. But most people never looked. They didn't want to. The world had a way of ignoring things that made it uncomfortable. And so, he became invisible. Every day at 7 a.m., he would take his place on the bench. He would sit through the chill of the morning, the rush of midday, the fading light of evening. Sometimes he shifted. Sometimes he rubbed his hands together against the cold. But never once did he leave his post early, not until the last bus of the night had passed. Only then, when the streets were empty and the town was quiet, would he rise slowly, tuck the photograph into the inside pocket of his coat, and disappear into the darkness. The town got used to him, the way people get used to background noise. He was part of the scenery, like the cracked pavement or the streetlight that buzzed above him. He didn't exist in their world until one day he didn't show up. It was a Tuesday morning, bitterly cold, when the bench sat empty. At first, nobody thought much of it. Maybe he overslept, maybe he was sick. But then Wednesday came, and Thursday, and the bench stayed empty. By Friday, people began to notice the absence. The kids walking to school slowed down, their eyes searching the stop where he always sat. The office workers on their way to catch the bus glanced around, uneasy. Even the barista at the corner coffee shop, the one who always brewed an extra cup just in case he ever wanted one, paused, frowning, as she looked out the window and saw nothing but an abandoned bench beneath the buzzing streetlight. It was as if the town had been holding its breath all along, and only now, in his absence, realized just how much space he had taken up in their lives. And then came the question that no one could answer. Who was he? No one knew his name. No one knew where he lived. No one knew why he sat there every day holding that picture. He had been a constant, a quiet shadow in the background of their lives, and they had ignored him completely, until now. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he had died. Others whispered that he had finally boarded a bus, vanished to some unknown destination. A few wondered if he had family somewhere waiting for him, the same way he had waited for someone. But the truth, as they would soon discover, was far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. It was the photograph that gave them the first clue. When the old man didn't show up for a week straight, someone finally called the police. A patrol officer, young and new to the force, drove down Main Street and checked the bench. Nothing. He asked around. Most people shrugged. Nobody had ever spoken to the man. Nobody knew his name, his address, or even if he had family. But then the barista from the corner cafe came forward. She said that once, months ago, she tried to hand him a free coffee. He had refused politely, almost shyly. But she remembered one thing. When the wind blew that morning, the photograph had slipped slightly out of his hand. She had seen the image clearly. A woman holding a baby, she told the officer. She was smiling, the way you smile at someone you love more than life itself. The officer asked if she remembered what the woman looked like. She shook her head. It was old, faded, but I remember thinking she must have been everything to him. The officer logged it into his report, but he didn't expect much to come from it. Missing persons didn't usually start with a nameless old man on a bench. Still, he kept digging. It turned out the man had been seen in the evenings walking down Oakwood Street, near the edge of town. A resident said he always walked the same path, slow and steady, as if counting his steps. Curious, the officer followed that route one night. It led to a small, crumbling house. The paint had long since peeled away, the roof sagged, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But in the front window sat a single lamp, glowing faintly. He knocked. No one answered. The house felt empty, abandoned, but when he peeked through the dusty glass, he saw it. Dozens of photographs pinned to the walls, spread across the table, tucked into old frames. All of the same woman, all of the same child. And in the center of the room, a crib, long, unused. It hit him then. This wasn't just an old man waiting for a bus. This was someone who had been waiting for years for something or someone that would never come. The officer got a warrant and entered the house the next day. Inside, the story unfolded like a wound being opened. The man's name was Walter Hayes. He had lived there alone for decades. The neighbors remembered him faintly. A quiet man, kept to himself. Once, long ago, there had been a wife, a daughter, but nobody had seen them in years. As the officer flipped through the photographs, the pieces began to fit together. The young woman in the picture was Walter's wife, Margaret. The baby was their daughter, Emily. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, were stacked in a drawer. One headline caught his eye. Tragic bus crash claims young mother and child. The article was from 1971. Walter's wife and daughter had been on their way to visit their sister in another town. Their bus had swerved on an icy road and crashed into a ravine. Dozens were injured. 2 passengers, Margaret Hayes and her 3-year-old daughter Emily, had died instantly. The bus route number? The same one that stopped at the bench where Walter sat every day. It all made sense now. He hadn't been waiting for a ride. He had been waiting for them. For 50 years, Walter Hayes had returned to that stop every single day, clutching the photograph of the family he lost, watching buses come and go, but never boarding one. As if, somehow, one day they might step off a bus and back into his life. It wasn't madness. It wasn't senility. It was devotion, pure and unshakable.
And now, he was gone. The officer stood in the middle of the ruined house, holding one of the faded photographs, feeling a heaviness in his chest he couldn't shake. He wondered how many times people had walked past Walter without saying a word. How many had laughed, whispered, or dismissed him as just some crazy old man. And all the while, Walter had been carrying the weight of a grief so deep that it had chained him to that bench for half a century. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because 3 days later, the bus stop bench was no longer empty. Someone had placed fresh flowers there. And the note, written in shaky handwriting, the kind that suggested a hand long unused to writing, were 5 words that made the entire town stop and breathe. I'm going home now. W.
The note and the flowers at the bus stop spread through town like wildfire. At first, no one could believe it. People who had walked past Walter Hayes for years, barely giving him a second thought, now crowded the corner of Main Street as if it had suddenly become sacred ground. The cafe worker cried when she saw the bouquet. Simple daisies, fresh and bright against the cold steel of the bench. Someone whispered that Walter had left them himself before disappearing, but others argued he didn't have the money, and where would he even buy flowers? Still, the message was clear. I'm going home now. The phrase sank into people's minds like an echo they couldn't shake. The police report officially listed him as a missing elderly male, but inside the precinct, the younger officer who had found Walter's house couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a disappearance, it was a farewell. And then more notes appeared. On the following Monday, taped neatly to the side of the bench, was a torn piece of lined paper. The handwriting was shaky, but undeniably Walter's. Thank you for keeping me company, even if you never knew it. By Wednesday, another. She had her mother's smile. I never stopped seeing it. By Friday, yet another. I'm not waiting anymore. It's time. Each note was short, almost like fragments of a diary, but together they painted a picture of a man who had finally made peace with his ghosts. The community began leaving things in response. A child placed a stuffed bear on the bench. A woman left a candle. Teenagers who once mocked him now sat quietly at the stop after school, heads bowed. Even the mayor stopped by, saying in a trembling voice, "This man sat here for 50 years and we ignored him. Shame on us." It was as though Walter's absence had created a hole that the entire town felt compelled to fill. And yet, questions gnawed at everyone. Where had he gone? Was he alive? Did he walk away? Did he die somewhere quietly, alone? The officer went back to Walter's house, searching for answers. This time, he noticed something he'd overlooked before. On the kitchen table, beneath a pile of photographs, was a single envelope addressed in careful handwriting. To whoever finds me. Inside, a letter. If you are reading this, then I suppose my story is finally over. My name is Walter Hayes. For 50 years, I came to the same bench and waited for my wife and daughter. Some may call it foolish, some may call it madness, but to me, it was the only way I knew to keep them alive. Every bus that stopped, I hoped. Every bus that left, I grieved again. And yet, hope kept me breathing. I know now that I will not see them again in this world, but I believe, no, I feel that they are waiting for me somewhere else. I can almost hear Margaret's laugh when the wind passes, and Emily's tiny footsteps when the leaves crunch beneath mine. I'm not afraid anymore. My waiting is done. And if you, stranger, find yourself reading this, then please do not pity me. I have lived with love so strong it lasted a lifetime, even in absence. Not everyone gets that gift. Take care of your people. Hold them close. Speak to them while you can. Because one day the bus stops coming, and all you have left are memories. Goodbye, Walter. The officer sat at the table, hands trembling as he finished the letter. He realized that Walter hadn't vanished without a trace. He had left behind something far more valuable. Not just grief, not just loss, but a reminder. Walter's 50 years on that bench were not wasted. They were a testimony, proof of how love could outlive tragedy, how devotion could endure beyond reason. That night, the officer returned to the bus stop and placed the letter in a plastic sleeve, taping it carefully to the bench. By morning, half the town had read it. Strangers cried openly in the street. Some left flowers, some prayed, and for the first time in decades, Walter Hayes was no longer invisible. But the story wasn't finished yet, because 2 weeks later, someone claimed they had seen him. 2 weeks after Walter Hayes' disappearance, just as the town began to accept the mystery as unsolvable, a rumor tore through the community like a spark in dry grass. A man had been seen. It started with an old farmer named Richard O'Donnell, who lived on the outskirts near the abandoned train tracks. He swore on his life that late one evening, he spotted a thin, elderly figure walking steadily along the rails. The man wore a long brown coat, the kind nobody had worn in decades. Richard said he recognized the hunched silhouette instantly. It was him, he insisted, his voice hoarse. Walter Hayes, walking like he was 20 again, head high, like he finally knew where he was going. At first, people dismissed the story as nonsense, wishful thinking from a lonely old farmer. But then, another sighting came in. A teenage girl claimed she saw him near the churchyard at dawn, standing in front of the memorial cross. He placed his hand on the stone, whispered something, and then simply kept walking. Within days, more reports emerged. Someone saw him on the hill overlooking the river. Another said they spotted him at the old train station. Each story carried the same detail. Walter looked at peace. Not desperate, not broken, but calm, purposeful. The town went into a frenzy. Newspapers ran headlines like, "The Ghost of Walter Hayes." Local radio stations speculated endlessly. Was he alive, wandering the countryside? Or was this something else? Something harder to explain. The officer who had found Walter's letter couldn't ignore it, driven by a mix of duty and something deeper, a need to honor the man's story. He retraced the supposed sightings. He stood by the tracks where Richard swore Walter had walked. He visited the churchyard. He waited at dawn, staring at the fog, half expecting Walter's frail figure to emerge. And then, one evening, he found something. Near the old train station, tucked between broken wooden planks, was a single fresh daisy, just like the ones left at the bus stop. Clean, bright, impossibly out of place in the crumbling ruins. The officer's pulse quickened. He looked closer. Beneath the flower was a scrap of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was shaky, almost faded, but unmistakable. Almost there. The officer's throat tightened. Almost there. Where was there? The discovery reignited the town's obsession. People formed search groups, combing the fields and tracks. Social media exploded with theories. Some said Walter was reenacting his life's journey, step by step. Others claimed he was leaving a trail for someone or something to follow. The bench at the bus stop transformed from a forgotten corner into a shrine. Flowers piled higher, candles burned every night, and the notes Walter left behind were now copied, printed, and shared across the internet. His words, once ignored, now touched strangers across the world. But not everyone believed the sightings. Skeptics argued that grief had made people see what they wanted, that Walter was gone, and the rest was imagination. Still, the officer couldn't shake the truth he felt in his bones. Walter wasn't finished. He was moving towards something. a destination. And then, one night, as the officer drove home past the empty fields, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure. Thin. Old. Standing tall in a brown coat. The officer slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. For a second, the man turned his head towards a light, just enough to reveal a familiar, lined face. Walter Hayes. And then, in the blink of an eye, he stepped into the fog and was gone. The officer scrambled out of his car, shouting Walter's name, but the field was empty, silent. Only the soft sound of wind in the grass. When he checked the ground, there was just one thing left behind. Another daisy, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The town had its answer. Walter Hayes was still out there, and he was leading them somewhere. But where? And why? The search for Walter was no longer about a missing man. It had become a pilgrimage, and the truth was closer than anyone realized.
The town had been living in two realities at once. In one, Walter Hayes was gone forever, a lonely old man who vanished into thin air, and the other, he was still out there, leaving behind flowers, whispers, and shadows that refused to die. The officer couldn't rest. He carried Walter's notes in his pocket, read them late at night like prayers. I'll keep walking. Don't forget me. Almost there. But almost where? That question burned inside him until he couldn't take it anymore. He decided to retrace Walter's steps, one final time. At dawn, he set out, past the bus stop where it all began, past the churchyard where the girl swore she saw him, past the broken train station where the daisy had been left. Each stop felt like part of a map, Walter's map. The officer walked for hours. Fields gave way to woods, then to the rocky edge of the river. And that's where he saw it. An old path, overgrown, half-hidden, leading upward toward the hills. Something tugged at him. He followed. The trail climbed higher, winding through silent pines until it opened to a clearing. And there, at the very top, stood a rusted metal bench, the kind you'd find at a forgotten bus stop decades ago, only this one faced the horizon, overlooking the whole town below. And sitting on the bench was Walter Hayes. His brown coat fluttered in the wind. His hands rested calmly on his knees. His eyes, clearer than the officer remembered, were fixed on the sunrise, breaking through the clouds. The officer froze. His chest pounded. "Walter!" The old man turned slowly, and he smiled. A tired, peaceful smile. "I told you," Walter said, his voice steady. "Almost there." The officer's throat tightened. Where is there, Walter? What are you looking for?" Walter lifted a trembling hand toward the lights spilling across the horizon. "All my life, I waited at stops. For buses that never came, for people who never showed. I kept hoping someone would sit beside me, but they never did." His eyes glistened. "So I started walking and walking until I realized I wasn't waiting for someone else. I was waiting for this." The officer stepped closer. "For what?" Walter's smile deepened, and for a moment he looked years younger. "For peace." He leaned back against the bench, the sunlight washing over his face. His eyes closed gently, as if he was finally allowing himself to rest. The officer reached out, panic flaring, "Walter!" But it was too late. Walter Hayes had gone still. The old man who had carried his loneliness for a lifetime was finally free. The officer sank beside him, trembling. Tears blurred his vision, but he couldn't look away from Walter's calm, almost glowing expression. He wasn't lost anymore. He had found his last stop. Hours later, when people followed the officer's trail and found them, the story spread like fire. Not just in the town, but everywhere. The picture of the bench facing the sunrise with a single daisy on it was shared across the internet. Thousands of strangers wrote messages like, "For Walter, who walked until he found peace, you're not forgotten. We all have a bench waiting for us." The officer never spoke publicly about what Walter said to him. Some things were too sacred to turn into headlines. But every year, on the same day, he climbed that hill and sat on the bench with 2 daisies. One for Walter, one for himself. And in time, the bench became a place people traveled from far away to see. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because they believed in something Walter Hayes had proved with his last walk. That even the loneliest soul carries a story worth remembering, and that sometimes the longest journeys end not in answers, but in peace.